All right, this is B.F. Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity. It's a very provocative title. The main idea of the book is that there are a lot of problems in the world that could be solved if we were a bit more thoughtful about how we educated people and basically how we educated people. And so what B.F. Skinner would like to do to fix these problems is to be very to have that level of preciseness on how you control people's behavior. And so, you can call it education or you can call it controlling people's behavior. The main idea of the book, though, is that a lot of other people are very nervous about using the techniques that B.F. Skinner is talking about because it does sound kind of like 1984. And specifically, to reference the title of the book, they're worried that using these techniques would impinge on people's freedom and it would impinge on people's dignity. And so the point of the book is basically, first of all, B.F. Skinner argues that there are a lot of problems in society that could be solved using these techniques. And then the second part of the book is he talks about how using these techniques he basically argues against using the traditional definition of freedom and the traditional definition of dignity. And so basically he's not arguing that we should get rid of freedom and dignity. He's saying that we should have those things. His point is that the current definition of those terms actually restricts our freedom and it kind of restricts our dignity. So, I'm not explaining it that well, but hopefully that'll give you a rough idea that the point of the book is that if we stick with, if we are reluctant to use these techniques because we're worried about freedom and dignity, we're actually going to end up with worse consequences. All right, so let me jump in. So now to explain the book itself, there are, I believe, 9 chapters in this book. The book is kind of short. It's about 200 pages. There are 9 chapters, and he actually wrote short end-of-chapter summaries for each chapter after he had written the entire book. And so you can go through the book itself and just skip to the end of each chapter and read the end-of-chapter summaries, and you'll have a good idea of what the book as a whole is talking about. And I think that this is going to be the way that books are written in the future, that most books are too disorganized. I think books in the future are going to be a lot more organized. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go and I'm going to read the end of chapter summaries, and then if you find any of what I say interesting, you can get the book and dive more deeply into that chapter. Or I might just record more videos in which I read the rest of the chapters in depth. But right now I'm just going to read the summaries. All right, so I'm going to start with, let me overview what the chapters are. Chapter 1 is a technology of behavior. Chapter 2 is freedom. Chapter 3 is dignity. Chapter 4 is punishment. Chapter 5 is alternatives to punishment. Chapter 6 is values. Chapter 7 is the evolution of a culture. Chapter 8 is the design of a culture. And Chapter 9 is what is man? The question mark. So now I'm going to read the summary to Chapter 1, a technology of behavior. Let me just find it. Here we go. Almost all our major problems involve human behavior, and they cannot be solved by physical and biological technology alone. What is needed is a technology of behavior, but we have been slow to develop the science from which such technology might be drawn. One difficulty is that almost all of what is called behavioral science continues to trace behavior to states of mind, feelings, traits of character, human nature, and so on. Physics and biology once followed similar practices and advanced only when they discarded them. The behavioral sciences have been slow to change, partly because the explanatory entities often seem to be directly observed. What he means there is that when you use the explanatory entity of, traits of character or feelings, you're directly observing it in the sense that when you walk around, you're aware of your own consciousness. So that's what he means by the explanatory entity is directly observed, that you observe your own feelings, and so you think, oh, that's the natural way to explain behavior. The behavioral sciences have been slow to change, partly because the explanatory entities often seem to be directly observed, and partly because other kinds of explanations have been hard to find. The environment is obviously important, but its role has remained obscure. It does not push or pull, it selects, and this function is difficult to discover and analyze. The role of natural selection in evolution was formulated only a little more than 100 years ago, and the selective role of the environment in shaping and maintaining the behavior of the individual is only beginning to be recognized and studied. As the interaction between organism and environment has come to be understood, however, effects once assigned to states of mind, feelings, and traits are beginning to be traced to accessible conditions, and a technology of behavior may therefore become available. So what he's saying there is an example of that last sentence. Let me read that last sentence again. As the interaction between organism and environment has come to be understood, however, effects once assigned to states of mind, feelings, and traits are beginning to be traced to accessible conditions. What he means there is, so for example, gambling is a good example, where when people used to explain gambling behavior or compulsive gambling behavior, they would say things like, oh, it makes you feel good. Right, that's why people are compulsive gamblers, because it makes them feel good. But what B.F. Skinner discovered is that you can think about it in another way, where you refer to the schedule of reinforcement. You refer to the pattern by which people are rewarded for their playing the game, and that is, he has demonstrated through experiments that the particular way in which these gambling games work are very effective at turning people into compulsive gamblers. So that's an example of how they used to explain this behavior of the compulsive gambler through states of mind, like feelings, and now once you know more about how behavior arises, you can in fact explain that behavior through something you can control. So you can control the schedule of reinforcement. You can control how a gambling game reinforces or rewards the person who's playing it. So, as the interaction between organism and environment has come to be understood, however, effects once assigned to states of mind, feelings, and traits are beginning to be traced to accessible conditions, and a technology of behavior may therefore become available. So what he's saying there is that once you know how this cause and effect works, you can then arrange an environment to create the behavior you want. So you can manufacture Mozarts. Whereas in the past, people would just think, oh, Mozart is just a genius. There's, you can't duplicate that. It's just, some people have it and some people don't. B.F. Skinner is not satisfied with that kind of explanation. He wants to be able to manufacture Mozarts. He wants to be able to make everybody a Mozart. So that's what he means by technology of behavior. Let me see this. It will not solve our problems, however, until it replaces traditional pre-scientific views, and these are strongly entrenched. So what he's saying is that the new way of looking at behavior needs to replace the old way of looking at behavior, and he's saying the old ways of looking at behavior are very strongly entrenched. I don't know which of these sentences are going to be difficult for you to understand, so I'm not sure which ones to repeat. So anyway, the next sentence, freedom and dignity illustrate the difficulty. They are the possessions of the autonomous man of traditional theory, and they are essential to practices in which a person is held, this is very important, and they are essential to practices in which a person is held responsible for his conduct and given credit for his achievements. Great example of that is when, and I think he's going to talk about that later, when you punish people, when you send them to prison, the reason people say it's okay to send people to prison is because they say that the guy deserved it, that the guy is responsible for his behavior. But what B.F. Skinner argues is that it's kind of like it's kind of like Frankenstein, but if you haven't read Frankenstein, you won't understand the reference. Where if a guy's acting bad, it's because his environment um, led him to act badly. And so what B.F. Skinner would argue you should do is just like a broken car. If a car breaks down, if you get angry, you might just smash the car. You might kick it and hit it with a baseball bat if you're angry at it. But most people would understand that if a car breaks down, it's not the car's fault. It's just a part went bad, or the environment led the car to behave badly. And so the smart way to respond to that is just to fix the car. And he would say the same thing is true of a person, where if a person is behaving badly, the smart reaction is to change the person's behavior so that the person acts well in the future. But B.F. Skinner's saying that the old way of looking at behavior, the old way of looking at people, is that they are not changeable. And if someone acts badly, then they're going to act like that forever. And so, hopefully that makes sense. So let me start over again. Freedom and dignity illustrate the difficulty. They are the possessions of the autonomous man of traditional theory, and they are essential to practices in which a person is held responsible for his conduct and given credit for his achievements. A scientific analysis shifts both the responsibility and the achievement to the environment. It also raises questions. Let me pause there. So a good example of that would be where everybody praises Tiger Woods or praises Mozart or praises Michael Jordan for their achievements. B.F. Skinner would say, well, let's not just praise Michael Jordan or Tiger Woods or Mozart, the person. Let's praise the environment that shaped them into the person they are. So, for example, with Mozart and Tiger Woods, they both had very strong fathers who molded their behavior as they were growing up. And they grew up in an environment where being good at that activity rewarded them. So they got to be the center of attention. When Mozart was young, he was playing in front of crowds. And I'm sure it was the same thing with Tiger Woods, where when you have lots of people going, ooh, wow, you're so good, that's amazing, it makes you feel good and it makes you want to practice more. And so that would be an example of how you wouldn't just praise the person for the behavior, you would draw attention to the environment as the source of the behavior. Anyway, so a scientific analysis shifts both the responsibility and the achievement to the environment. It also raises questions concerning values. Who will use a technology, and to what ends? Until these issues are resolved, a technology of behavior will continue to be rejected, and with it, possibly the only way to solve our problems. So that is Chapter 1, a technology of behavior. And I think that's just an introduction to his point. I think it's just like a summary of his whole point. So now I think he's going to delve a little bit more deeply into the subject. So Chapter 2 is freedom. So I think he's going to talk a little bit more about the problem of the traditional way of thinking about freedom. So Chapter 2, freedom. Man's struggle for freedom is not due to a will to be free, but to certain behavioral processes characteristic of the human organism, the chief effect of which is the avoidance of or escape from so-called aversive features of the environment. So that might be a very difficult sentence for you to understand, but basically what he's saying is that when people say they want to be free, when people say, in the United States, everyone has freedom is a right, what they mean is that if you ask them what specifically do you mean by free, usually what they mean is not being bothered, not being restrained, not having other people making you feel bad or not having other people make you feel bad. I think that's really what it comes down to. So that's what he means by the avoidance of or escape from so-called aversive features of the environment. So an aversive feature of the environment, an example of an aversive feature of the environment would be, being whipped if you're a slave. That would be an aversive feature of that environment. Or, to use the same example, being kept in uncomfortable living conditions. That would be an aversive feature of being in the environment of being a slave. And so what he's saying is that the human organism, people, have a natural tendency to want to escape those kinds of unpleasantries. And so he's saying that that is the essence of the drive to be free. The essence of it is to escape those unpleasantries, and it's not, and he's being more specific, and it's not simply a desire to escape from the influence of another person, right? So he's saying that it's not the essence of the will to be free, the essence of the motivation to be free is not escaping from other people's control. The essence of it is escaping from the unpleasantries. I think that's what he's saying there. And it's an important point for him, because he's going to say that, if we allow ourselves to be subject to the influence of the right conditions, we can end up with a much better society, and everyone will be more happy, and everything will be great. Okay, so let's read the next sentence. So man's struggle for freedom is not due to a will to be free, but to certain behavioral processes characteristic of the human organism, the chief effect of which is the avoidance of or escape from so-called aversive features of the environment. Physical and biological technologies have been mainly concerned with natural aversive stimuli. So I think what he means there is, so for example, the cold, being cold, or being really hot, or starving because of famine. So what he's saying is that physical and biological technologies, all of the technology that we've created, like an axe or irrigation, those were technologies. Those technologies were created to deal with natural unpleasantries like famine. No person is, in general, in the old days, no person was responsible for the famine. It was just the weather that was doing that. And so that's what he's saying, is that physical and biological technologies are mainly to deal with those natural unpleasantries. The struggle for freedom is concerned with stimuli intentionally arranged by other people. Intentionally arranged by other people. So, for example, with slavery, the unpleasantness of your living conditions is something that's arises from another person. It's not Mother Nature who's doing that. It's a person who's got you in that unpleasant situation. And when they're whipping you, it's a person who's responsible for that unpleasant situation. So that's what he's saying is the essence of the struggle for freedom. It's dealing with unpleasantries that are controlled by other people. The literature of freedom has identified the other people. The literature of freedom has identified the other people and has proposed ways of escaping from them, or weakening or destroying their power. So I think what he's saying there, he's making a general statement. So what he's saying is, any time you look at any country and you look at any example of people talking about freedom, if you say, look at what's in common with all of the writings in all the different countries about freedom, when they talk about freedom, and what he's saying you'll see in common is that they identify the person who is responsible for the unpleasant condition, and they propose ways of escaping from that person, or weakening that person's power, or destroying that person's power. He's saying that that's something that's in common between all of the writing that you'll find in the world about the idea of freedom. It has been successful, this literature has been successful in reducing the aversive stimuli used in intentional control. So what he's saying there is that these efforts for freedom have worked at reducing the use of torture and crucifixion. They've been successful at reducing these unpleasantries in controlling behavior. But it has made the mistake of defining freedom in terms of states of mind or feelings. This is a key point for him. This is like one of the major ideas in the book. And where's my pencil? I'm going to put an exclamation point there because that is one of the key ideas, one of the major ideas in this book. But it has made the mistake of defining freedom in terms of states of mind or feelings, and it has therefore not been able to deal effectively with techniques of control which do not breed escape or revolt, but nevertheless have aversive consequences. Let me read that again. It has therefore not been able to deal effectively with techniques of control which do not breed escape or revolt, but nevertheless have aversive consequences. So an example, so there's another general statement, but an example of that would be compulsive gambling. So this nature of, you have all these people talking about freedom, and they say, oh, we want people to be free to choose what they do. The problem with the way they're doing it is that the way they think about the issue doesn't allow them to help people who seem to be choosing this unpleasant situation. So, for example, the compulsive gambler, according to the old way of thinking, is freely choosing to go and gamble all of his money away. And it's because of the way the freedom people think about what freedom is. They think about it being a feeling of wanting to do it, of wanting to do the activity, of wanting to be in the situation. And so the compulsive gambler, to them, is free to choose what he's doing. And B.F. Skinner's saying that's bad. He's saying that that's a problem because it's going to lead to those people are going to be unhappy. So that's what he means by aversive consequences. So the compulsive gambler losing all of his money would be an aversive consequence. And aversive just means unpleasant. So let me read that sentence again because it's a key one. It has made the mistake of defining freedom in terms of states of mind or feelings, and it has therefore not been able to deal effectively with techniques of control which do not breed escape or revolt, but nevertheless have aversive consequences. So another example of that might be the use of propaganda to lead societies into wars that hurt everybody. So, maybe Adolf Hitler in World War II would be an example of that, where, the propaganda, I don't know. Maybe that's not a great example, but, so anyway, let me continue. The literature of freedom has been forced to brand all control as wrong, and to misrepresent many of the advantages to be gained from a social environment. It is unprepared for the next step, which is not to free men from control, but to analyze and change the kinds of control to which they are exposed. So this is like way ahead of its time, in my opinion. This guy's really smart. The idea that he's saying in that sentence is so out there. Like, I don't think I hear anybody talking about stuff like that. So it's just a really, really good idea. So like what he's saying there is, he's saying like education is kind of haphazard right now. The law is kind of haphazard. He wants to make it like a science in the same way that you have NASA doing all of this science to send a rocket to the moon or to Mars. He wants to have scientists that do the same kind of thing that will get everybody to be happy. And he's saying that, right now it's just kind of, people are just kind of trying random things and it's not very scientific. And he's saying that the old way of thinking about freedom is part of what's holding us back, is that we're not willing to think about people as being machine-like in the same way that a rocket ship is, and being people aren't willing to think about people being manipulatable like a rocket ship is, where you can kind of direct where it's going in a very clear way. I think that's what he's saying in that chapter. So that's the end of the summary of chapter 2. Chapter 2 is freedom. And now chapter 3 is dignity. So let me get to the summary here. All right. So the summary of chapter 3, dignity. We recognize a person's dignity or worth when we give him credit for what he has done. He's defining dignity there. That's what he's just saying what he means by dignity. We recognize a person's dignity or worth when we give him credit for what he has done. The amount of credit we give is inversely proportional to the conspicuousness of the causes of his behavior. So it's a bit of a vague statement, but he gives an example in the next sentence. For example, if we do not know why a person acts as he does, we attribute his behavior to him. We try to gain, and another example is, we try to gain additional credit for ourselves by concealing the reasons why we behave in given ways, or by claiming to have acted for less powerful reasons. So there's some great examples of this. So one example would be when people say that they are starting a particular business because they want to help society instead of because they want to make money. He's saying that when people do that, if people believe him, people believe that he's doing it, the person is doing it because they want to help society, they attribute more dignity to that person because that person is acting for less obviously conspicuous, because I don't know how to put it, because the conspicuousness of the causes of his behavior, well, the causes of his behavior seem less powerful. I don't know how to describe it very well. But another example of this that I think about is, when well, I don't know, but let me just continue. I have a couple examples that are floating around in my mind, but I'm not sure if they're perfect examples, so I don't want to say them unless I know they're perfect, or unless I know they're pretty likely to be good examples. So we avoid infringing on the credit due to others by controlling them inconspicuously. And so what he means by that is, if you're a parent, I think this is an example. If you're a parent and you have a kid who has a project in school, you can help your child do the project well, and if nobody knows about it, if nobody knows that you did help the child with the project, then they give the credit to the child. But if they know that you helped the child, then they will give the credit to you. So there's an example of how they try to gain additional credit by concealing, or let me see. The sentence for that was, we avoid infringing on the credit due to others by controlling them inconspicuously. We admire people to the extent that we cannot explain what they do. And the word admire then means marvel at. Okay. So all of these things that he's just talking about it's all about controlling behavior. That's what's tying all of this stuff together, is that in the past, whether or not you understood the cause of someone's behavior would have a big impact on what you thought about that person. What we may call the literature of dignity is concerned with preserving due credit. And so he's defining what he means by the literature of dignity. The literature of dignity may oppose advances in technology, including a technology of behavior, because they destroy chances to be admired, and a basic analysis, the literature of dignity may oppose a basic analysis because it offers an alternative explanation of behavior for which the individual himself has previously been given credit. So then he concludes, the literature thus stands in the way of further human achievements. I'm kind of disappointed in my ability to come up with clear examples of what he's talking about here. But basically, I think what he's saying is that we have a lot of people who take pride, or we have a lot of people who find enjoyment, they feel good about themselves because they are given credit for certain achievements that they've done. And what I think B.F. Skinner is saying is that if, as a society, if we all start saying, oh, wait, look, it's your environment that determines your behavior, and so we should give the credit to your environment for making you who you are. I think what B.F. Skinner is saying is that there are a lot of people who have an interest in continuing to receive credit for these things that they've done, and they would feel bad if everyone around them started saying, oh, well, actually, we're not going to give you the credit anymore. I'm going to stop telling you, oh, wow, you're so cool, how do you blah, blah, blah. I'm going to stop doing that because now I know that it was your environment that turned you into who you are. And so I no longer marvel at you. Instead, I understand that it was your environment. So it's kind of like a magic trick. So I think what he's saying here is it's kind of like you have all of these people. Imagine if you have a magician and he has a magic trick that he does, and nobody knows how he does the trick. And so all of these people are giving attention to the magician and saying, wow, you're so good, it's amazing, it's really magic. That magician would not want to have people understand how the trick was done, right? And so what B.F. Skinner is saying is that a lot of people who are currently getting credit for their achievements are like those magicians, where they don't want everyone else to understand how the trick was done. They don't want everyone else to understand that it was the environment that led them to achieve those achievements. And so he's saying that way of thinking, that invested interest, is holding us back, because it's just like imagine if you're trying to teach the whole world how to do that particular magic trick, right? And nobody knows how to do it. So what you need to do is you need to explain to everybody how it's done. But that magician who knows how to do it and has everybody marveling at him, he doesn't want that to spread around, because it would. I can, even as I listen to myself, I'm not very satisfied with my analogy. But hopefully, it's not very easy for me to come up with an analogy on the spot. But hopefully, you get a rough sense of the picture here. I'm just trying to get a rough sense of what he's saying across. So that's chapter, I think, 3, dignity. And so now chapter 4 is punishment. Chapter 4, punishment. Except when physically constrained, a person is least free or dignified when under the threat of punishment. I think that's him saying his own opinion. I think. Yeah. Except when physically constrained, a person is least free or dignified when under the threat of punishment. We should expect, then, that the literatures and freedom and of freedom and dignity would oppose punitive techniques. But in fact, they have acted to preserve them. A person who has been punished is not thereby simply less inclined to behave in a given way. At best, he learns how to avoid punishment. So let me read that sentence again. So first of all, he makes the point that this old way of thinking about freedom and dignity, they claim to be all about being free, but in fact, they are supporting these ways of controlling behavior that are making people less free. So this is an example of how his book has a very provocative title, but in fact, all of the stuff he's saying is he's trying to make the world a better place. It's not like he's some kind of crazy person that wants to control everybody and turn them into slaves or something. He's trying to make the world a better place, and what he's saying is that this old way of thinking has all of these bad side effects. So, a person who has been punished is not thereby simply less inclined to behave in a given way. What he's saying there is, what would be an example of that? If someone likes to smell the roses, right? If someone enjoys smelling roses and you punish them for smelling the roses, you don't make them, by doing that, by punishing them for smelling the roses, you are not making them let less inclined to smell roses. They still want to smell roses. They're just going to try to avoid the punishment. So you're not making them want to smell the roses less. A person who has been punished is not thereby simply less inclined to behave in a given way. At best, he learns how to avoid punishment. Some ways of doing so are maladaptive or neurotic, such as in the so-called Freudian dynamisms. I don't know what the Freudian dynamisms are. In fact, anything involving Freud, I'm not really a fan of of what I know about him. But I think the main idea is the first part. Some ways of doing so are maladaptive or neurotic. So some ways of people avoiding punishment are bad, maladaptive. They're not to be desired. I'm trying to think of an example of that. I can't come up with an example off the top of my head, but with further thought, I could probably come up with something. Anyway, so to continue. So other ways of avoiding punishment include avoiding situations in which punished behavior is likely to occur and doing things which are incompatible with punished behavior. So those are ways of avoiding punishment. Other people may take similar steps to reduce the likelihood that a person will be punished. Other people may take similar steps to reduce the likelihood that a person will be punished. But the literatures of freedom and dignity object to this as leading only to automatic goodness. Okay, so what B.F. Skinner is stressing in that sentence is the other people. So other people may take similar steps. So what he's saying there is, so he gave an example of avoiding a way to avoid punishment. You can avoid punishment by avoiding situations in which the punished behavior is likely to occur. If you had another, you could also have other people taking that step to reduce the likelihood that a person will be. So an example of that would be, imagine if you took all of the people, imagine if smelling roses was illegal in a society. What you could do is you could take all of the people who like to smell roses and just put them in a part of the country where there are no roses. And what he's saying is that these people, the literatures of freedom and dignity, would object to that method. And they say that they object to it because it leads only to automatic goodness. And I need to see an example of that, because I think what he's saying there is, the roses example they might not object to, but I think what he would like to do is more sophisticated methods of getting people to stop doing the bad behavior. And I think what he's saying is that the literatures of freedom and dignity don't want those more sophisticated methods of controlling behavior. They don't want to have automatic goodness. Under punitive contingencies, what he means there is, punitive means punished, contingency means it's like a effect or reward. So if you have a punitive effect or a punishment, a contingency is just something that happens when something else happens. So, if a button makes a noise whenever I push it, then the noise is the contingency of pushing the button. So that's what contingency means. So under punitive contingencies, a person appears to be free to behave well and to deserve credit when he does so. So what he's saying there is, if you keep the person who likes to smell roses, if you keep him in an area where there still are roses, then you then the person seems to have the choice of whether or not he wants to smell the roses or not. So he seems to be free to behave well or to not behave well. And when he does behave well, he gets credit. He gets the credit for behaving well. And I think what the point and if there are no roses there at all, then he does not deserve credit for behaving well. So I think that's what B.F. Skinner is saying is the problem with the old way of thinking about freedom and dignity. It has this idea that, oh, well, we need to have these people have the credit for behaving well. They need to have the choice, and they need to choose behaving well. I'm not doing a great job of explaining it, but hopefully it gives a rough idea of what he's saying. So under punitive contingencies, a person appears to be free to behave well and to deserve credit when he does so. Non-punitive contingencies generate the same behavior. So what he's saying is that you can get the same behavior, the same exact behavior of not smelling the roses without having to use punishment, but a person cannot then be said to be free, and the contingencies deserve the credit when he behaves well. So I think the example there is that if you just put the person in an area where there are no roses, then the person doesn't get the credit for behaving well. The person doesn't get the credit for not smelling roses. It's the environment or the contingent. In that case, I don't think there are contingencies, but in that case, it's not the person who gets the credit. And so B.F. Skinner is pointing this out, that this is not a good way of thinking about things. He's saying that this whole idea of, the person has to have credit for it is just not the best way of thinking about these problems. And if we want to continue to solve more sophisticated problems in the world, like world peace and poverty and crime, we have to become more sophisticated in how we look at behavior. So non-punitive contingencies generate the same behavior, but a person cannot then be said to be free, and the contingencies deserve the credit when he behaves well. Little or nothing remains for autonomous man to do and receive credit for doing. He does not engage in moral struggle, and therefore has no chance to be a moral hero or credited with inner virtues. So he's saying that this is the way that he's saying that those last few sentences are just talking about how the old way of thinking has this idea of moral struggle, and it wants people to have that kind of struggle, and he's saying that that's not ideal. And he's saying that this new sophisticated way of controlling behavior would not have that kind of moral struggle. And so the old way of thinking about it would not like this new way of controlling behavior. So he continues, but our task is not to encourage moral struggle or to build or demonstrate inner virtues. It is to make life less punishing, and in doing so, to release for more reinforcing activities the time and energy consumed in the avoidance of punishment. Okay. Up to a point, the literatures of freedom and dignity have played a part in the slow and erratic alleviation of aversive features of the human environment, including the aversive features used in intentional control. So what he's saying in that sentence is that he's not totally critical of the old way of thinking about freedom and dignity. He's saying that they did play a part. They got us, they got us pretty far from the way things used to be to the way things are now. So he's not totally criticizing them. But they have formulated the task in such a way that they cannot now accept the fact that all control is exerted by the environment, and proceed to the design of better environments rather than of better men. So he's saying that is like a summary of his point. Basically that to move on from where we are now, we need to control the environment, and he's saying that the old way of thinking about it just doesn't accept that kind of that way of solving problems. So anyway, So the next chapter is chapter 5, Alternatives to Punishment. The freedom and dignity of autonomous man seem to be preserved only when weak forms of non-aversive control are used. So non-aversive control would be giving people a lollipop when they do what you want. That would be non-aversive. Aversive means unpleasant. Non-aversive means not unpleasant, or it means non-aversive might mean pleasurable. And he's saying that a weak form of non-aversive control would be something like a lollipop. And so he's saying that the freedom and dignity of autonomous man seem to be preserved only when weak forms of non-aversive control are used. Those who use them seem to defend themselves against the charge that they are attempting to control behavior, and they are exonerated when things go wrong. So the main idea of that sentence is that these people that use non-aversive control, they say, oh, we're not trying to control behavior, that we're not trying to control people. And I think what B.F. Skinner is saying is that that shouldn't be something that you have to defend yourself against. There shouldn't be anything wrong with trying to control behavior, as long as you're doing it in a smart way, as long as you're trying to make everything better off, instead of just using it as propaganda that will lead people to a worse situation. And he says that these people that use these methods are exonerated when things go wrong. And he's saying what he means by that is that when these people that use these methods of control, when it doesn't work, it makes everybody feel better, because it makes everybody feel like these people don't have total control over the person that they are trying to control. And so that's what he means by they are exonerated when things go wrong. Permissiveness is the absence of control, and if it appears to lead to desirable results, it is only because of other contingencies. Let me read that again. Permissiveness is the absence of control, and if it appears to lead to desirable results, it is only because of other contingencies. I think what he's saying there is, so imagine if you have a school. Imagine if you have a school, and the school is only 5 hours a day, or 6 hours a day, or 7 hours a day. And that is a relatively permissive schedule for the school. So it's not 24 hours a day that you're in the school. And imagine that some of the students end up doing well, and other students end up not doing well. So you would say that the school is a permissive school. It's not totally locked down. To use the kind of the image that someone with freedom and dignity would use. So it's not a totally locked down school. It's a permissive school. And what B.F. Skinner is saying is that if that school leads to desirable results, it's because of other contingencies. Meaning, so when the kid goes home, if his parents are forcing him to do his homework, that is why the kid does well. And if another kid's parents are not forcing him to do his homework, that's why the kid is not doing well. And so what B.F. Skinner is pointing out is that I think what he's just trying to emphasize is that control is not a bad thing. And that if you think that something is not controlled, it's really that it is controlled. It's just that it's controlled by something you're not aware of. I think that's the point he's trying to make. So permissiveness is the absence of control, and if it appears to lead to desirable results, it is only because of other contingencies. Maeutics, or the art of midwifery, so this is jargon. The art of midwifery. I don't know why he calls it that. Basically what Maeutics is the idea that you just have to help the student, you have to draw the information out of the student, or you have to help the student discover the stuff on their own. That's what he means by the art of midwifery. So a midwife is someone who helps the wife give birth, right? The midwife doesn't give birth. herself. What she does is she helps the wife give birth. And so meiotics is the same idea applied to education or applied to behavior, where you are not forcing the behavior yourself, or you're not forcing the information into the student yourself, you're just helping the student to discover the information, something like that. You can look it up on Wikipedia. It has a Wikipedia entry. So meiotics, or the art of midwifery, seems to leave behavior to be credited to those who give birth to it. You see the analogy? So the wife gets the credit for giving birth to the child, not the midwife. And in this case, this method of affecting behavior, this method of education, gives the credit of the behavior to the student. It's not the teacher who gets the credit, it's the student who gets the credit. So that's what the whole idea of meiotics is and midwifery. So meiotics, or the art of midwifery, seems to leave behavior to be credited to those who give birth to it, and the guidance of development to those who develop. So human intervention seems to be minimized when a person is made dependent upon things rather than upon other people. Let me read that again. Human intervention seems to be minimized when a person is made dependent upon things rather than upon other people. What would be an example of that? I think an example of that might be when people behave themselves because they get money for behaving themselves or something like that, or rather than they behave themselves because it's not a great example. You'd have to go into the book itself to get an example of that. But he's basically just pointing out one way that he's pointing out something that affects the degree to which people think that a person's behavior is their own doing or if it's controlled. Alternatives to punishment. So this whole chapter is alternatives to punishment. So human intervention seems to be minimized when a person is made dependent upon things rather than upon other people. Various ways of changing behavior by changing minds are not only condoned, but vigorously practiced by the defenders of freedom and dignity. There is a good deal to be said for minimizing current control by other people, but other measures still operate. Current control by other people. I don't know what that's referring to. Current control by other people. A person who responds in acceptable ways to weak forms of control may have been changed by contingencies which are no longer operative. I think what he's saying there is that if you have somebody who so imagine you have an employee and you tell the employee, would you please get me a cup of water, or you say, I'll give you a lollipop if you get me a cup of water. And if B.F. Skinner's saying if that works to get the person to do their behavior, it might be that it's not the cup of water, it's not the lollipop that is motivating that person to do it, or how do I put it? It's not the lollipop that is responsible for that person doing that thing that you want them to do. It's that there were other things that happened in the past that got that person to behave that way. I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it. But a person who responds in acceptable ways to weak forms of control may have been changed by contingencies which are no longer operative. Trying to think of another example of that, but it's difficult for me. The main point, the main thing he's trying to say is that these people that defend the old way of thinking about freedom and dignity, they have this way of they want to use weak forms of control. And what B.F. Skinner is saying is that weak forms of control will work only when there were other kinds of control that you don't know about that happened in the past. that made those people respond to those weak forms of control, something like that. By refusing to recognize them, by refusing to recognize those contingencies which are no longer operative, the defenders of freedom and dignity encourage the misuse of controlling practices and block progress toward a more effective technology of behavior. So yeah, he's basically just saying that the old way of thinking about it is not accurate, and when you have an inaccurate view of how behavior works, it's going to prevent us from making progress. It's the same as if you thought the Earth was the center of the universe, or if you thought that the Earth was flat. It would prevent you from making progress if you were trying to, send a man to the moon. So you need to have a realistic view of how the universe works, of what space looks like. You need to have a realistic idea of how that works in order to get a man on the moon. So B.F. Skinner is saying the same thing. We're stuck in this old way of thinking about behavior, just like people used to be stuck in the old way of thinking that the Earth was flat, or the Earth was the center of the universe. So the next chapter is chapter 6, Values. The struggle for freedom and dignity has been formulated as a defense of autonomous man, rather than as a revision of the contingencies of reinforcement under which people live. Let me repeat that. The struggle for freedom and dignity has been formulated as a defense of autonomous man, rather than as a revision of the contingencies of reinforcement under which people live. I think what he's saying there is that the revision of the contingencies of reinforcement under which people live is what it should be. Yeah, it's what it should be. And he's saying it's what it is. I think what he's saying is that what these guys did, what this freedom and dignity thing, this whole movement, what they did was they revised the contingencies of reinforcement under which people live. They changed the rewards that people were subject to. And he's saying that the way that these people describe what they did, the way that these people, the freedom and dignity people, describe what they did, is they don't use those terms, they don't use those concepts of revising the contingencies. What they say is that they were defending autonomous man. And so I think what B.F. Skinner is saying is that that inaccuracy, that difference between what they were really doing, what they were really aiming for, and what they say they were aiming for, that discrepancy is bad, and it's going to lead to problems. So the struggle for freedom and dignity has been formulated as a defense of autonomous man, rather than as a revision of the contingencies of reinforcement under which people live. A technology of behavior is available. A technology of behavior is available which would more successfully reduce the aversive consequences of behavior. So again, he's using academic jargon. So an aversive consequence of behavior would be like crime. So a technology of behavior is available which would more successfully reduce crime, proximate or deferred. It would more successfully reduce the aversive consequences of behavior, proximate or deferred. And proximate means immediate, and deferred means happening later. So I think crime would be a proximate consequence. Yeah, crime would be a proximate aversive consequence of behavior. Or maybe getting in a car crash would be a proximate aversive consequence of your behavior because it's an immediate bad feeling. And a deferred aversive consequence would be something like, losing all of your money because you're a compulsive gambler, because it doesn't happen immediately, it happens later. Or another example would be, not saving money for your retirement and ending up in a bad spot when you're older. That would be a deferred aversive consequence of the behavior of not saving money when you're younger. So he's saying that this technology of behavior can deal with both of those bad consequences. It can help fix both of those. And this technology of behavior can maximize the achievements of which the human organism is capable. So you can manufacture Mozarts, or create lots of Larry Pages. But the defenders of freedom oppose its use. So the defenders of freedom are opposing this technology of behavior. The opposition may raise certain questions concerning values. So this is the chapter, Values. Who is to decide what is good for man? That's one of the questions of values. How will a more effective technology be used? By whom? And to what end? These are really questions about reinforcers. So just to talk about the questions they're asking, they're kind of, an example of that would be, well, are we going to come up with this technology to control people, and then it's going to be used by the next Adolf Hitler, or the next Joseph Stalin, or the next North Korea, to create an army of brainwashed people who are going to be unhappy, but be controlled by this dictator. That's what they're worried about, and it's a legitimate concern. It's a real concern. So B.F. Skinner responds, these are really questions about reinforcers, and that is a bit too vague for me to understand immediately. I'm going to hope the next sentence makes it clear what he's talking about. So I'm going to put a question mark there. So these are really questions about reinforcers. Some things have become good during the evolutionary history of the species, and they may be used to induce people to behave for, quote, the good of others. When used to excess, they may be challenged, and the individual may turn to things good only to him. I'm confused. Okay, so unfortunately, I may need to read this chapter to understand what he's saying here. So I'm going to read through it. I may not be able to come up with examples because I haven't read this. If I have read this chapter, it was a while ago, so I don't really understand what he's saying here, but I'll read it. So the opposition may raise certain questions concerning values. Who is to decide what is good for man? How will a more effective technology be used? By whom and to what end? These are really questions about reinforcers. Some things have become good during the evolutionary history of the species, and they may be used to induce people to behave for, quote, the good of others. I think what he's saying there is, that sentence is, so when you get someone to behave for the good of others, that would be something like not stealing someone else's stuff, or fighting as a soldier to defend other people in your country. And what you do to get people to do those things that helps someone else is you reward people with things that have become that have become good through evolution, like not money, but food or respect, status, stuff like that. So I'll read that one more time. Some things have become good during the evolutionary history of the species. Some things have become, quote, good during the evolutionary history of the species, and they may be used to induce people to behave for, quote, the good of others. When used to excess, they may be challenged, I don't know an example of that. And the individual may turn to things good only to him. I think what he's saying there is if you get people to behave too much for the good of other people at the person's own expense, I think maybe that's what he's saying. So when used to excess, they may be challenged, and the individual may turn to things good only to him. So that would be an example of that would be stealing, maybe, because that hurts the other person, but it's good for you because you get that thing. The challenge may be answered by intensifying the contingencies which generate behavior for the good of others. So an example of that would be, giving people more status for joining the army. Somehow maybe you put more advertisements up praising people who join the army, or maybe you give rewards. You imagine if you had a society where people started getting money rewards for not having a criminal record. So you're increasing the benefits of not having a criminal record. You're increasing the benefits of behaving in ways that benefit other people. Another example of that would be the fact that people can now get high-paying jobs as police officers. You're increasing the benefit for those people of behaving themselves because they can get this nice job as a police officer, whereas those people in the past may have been the same kind of people that would have joined the mafia and would have started stealing from other people. So I think that's what he means by this challenge may be answered by intensifying the contingencies which generate behavior for the good of others, or by pointing to previously neglected individual gains, such as those conceptualized as security, order, health, wealth, or wisdom. That is a little bit more difficult for me to come up with an example for. Again, I think an example is probably to be found in the chapter. But I think my police example possibly fits into that too. So if you have somebody, someone in a society who doesn't want to do something, you can say, hey man, well, look at how bad things used to be. You'd have people robbing each other. There was no security. There was no order. There was no wealth. And look at the way things are now. You have all these great things, so it's worth behaving in this way that everyone is behaving in, that's helping get us all these benefits. So I think that is an example of what he's saying there, where pointing to previously neglected individual gains, such as those conceptualized as security, order, health, wealth, or wisdom. So I think what he's saying there is that if an individual is challenging the control, you can remind that person about benefits that they forgot about. You can point to previously neglected by that person, previously neglected individual gains. I think that's what he's saying there. Possibly indirectly, other people bring the individual under the control of some remote consequences of his behavior, and the good of others then redounds to the good of the individual. I think an example of that would be the soldier example. Other people bring the individual under the control of some remote consequences of his behavior. So, of the remote consequences of the soldier's behavior is the defense of the country and the avoiding having other countries control you and impose taxes on you. So that would be a remote consequence of the soldier's behavior, because it doesn't happen immediately once the guy agrees to join the army, or immediately once the guy starts being in the army. But what you do is you have the citizens take those remote consequences and they make it an immediate reinforcer to the soldier. So they praise the soldier. When the soldier's walking around town, they go, thank you for serving our nation. And so you take the remote consequence of avoiding the taxes of the invading country, and you make that reinforcement immediate by praising the soldier right now for serving. I think that's what he's saying there. So other people bring the individual under the control of some remote consequences of his behavior, and the good of others then redounds to the good of the individual. Another kind of good which makes for human progress remains to be analyzed. Another kind of good which makes for human progress remains. So I don't know what he's talking about there, so I'm going to put a question mark. So now chapter 7, the evolution of a culture. Chapter 7, the evolution of a culture. The social environment is what is called a culture. It shapes and maintains the behavior of those who live in it. A given culture evolves as new practices arise, possibly for irrelevant reasons, and are selected by their contribution to the strength of the culture as it, quote, competes with the physical environment and with other cultures. It's a very good description. And in fact, this seems to have a lot of connections to business and also to militaries where, for example, a lot of businesses talk about the importance of culture in your company. And even Sun Tzu, a lot of military guys talk, Sun Tzu specifically talked about how important it is to have the moral way before you attack. In other words, you need to have your people convinced that what you're doing is the right thing, or more specifically, it's in the interests of the nation, or in the interests of the general public. And so that kind of fits into the same thing of culture. So all of these people agree that it's very important. So a given culture, I'm going to read that again. A given culture evolves as new practices arise, possibly for irrelevant reasons, and are selected by their contribution to the strength of the culture as it, quote, competes with the physical environment and with other cultures. A major step is the emergence of practices which induce members to work for the survival of their culture. So like being a soldier. A major step is the emergence of practices which induce members to work for the survival of their culture. Yeah, being a soldier is like a classic example of that. Such practices cannot be traced to personal goods, even when used for the good of others, since the survival of a culture beyond the lifetime of the individual cannot serve as a source of conditioned reinforcers. Let me pause there and make sure I understand that. Such practices cannot be traced to personal goods. I don't I don't totally understand what he's saying there. I think I understand roughly what he's saying, but I don't totally understand. So I'm a little bit vague on that. Okay. So I'll read it one more time. Such practices of getting people to behave, let me start from the previous sentence. A major step is the emergence of practices which induce members to work for the survival of their culture. Such practices cannot be traced to personal goods, even when used for the good of others, since the survival of a culture beyond the lifetime of the individual cannot serve as a source of conditioned reinforcers. Other people may survive the person they induce to act for their good, and the culture whose survival is at issue is often identified with them or their organizations. But the evolution of a culture introduces an additional kind of good or value. A culture which, for any reason, induces its members to work for its survival is more likely to survive. It is a matter of the good of the culture, not of the individual. Explicit design promotes that good by accelerating the evolutionary process. And since a science and a technology of behavior make for better design, They are important, quote, mutations in the evolution of a culture. Explicit design promotes that good by accelerating the evolutionary process. Okay? If there is any purpose or direction in the evolution of a culture, it has to do with bringing people under the control of more and more of the consequences of their behavior. I'm going to put an exclamation point under that last sentence, and I'm going to put a question mark next to a sentence, a couple sentences before that. So just to like sum up this chapter, I think he's just talking about how, well, the name of the chapter gives a good idea. It's about how cultures evolve. So cultures are a thing that compete with each other and that evolve. And he points out that if you look at the direction that cultures are changing in, if you look at the way that they're evolving, they are making people more and more under the control of the consequences of their behavior. So I think what he's saying there is, look, this is the way things are going in, so we should just take it even further. So he's kind of like drawing a trend, and he's saying, look, this is the way things have been going anyway, so let's just keep going in that direction. And the direction is bringing people under the control of the consequences of their behavior. I think that's what he's saying there. A lot of very interesting ideas. And my brain was buzzing with examples while I was reading it. So anyway, I'm going to read the next chapter. So the summary of the next chapter is chapter 8, the design of a culture. So I think evolution of a culture was just introducing that idea that cultures evolve. And maybe in this chapter he'll be talking about how to design a culture. So a culture is like the experimental space used in the study of behavior. It is a set of contingencies of reinforcement, a concept which has only recently begun to be understood. The technology of behavior which emerges is ethically neutral, but when applied to the design of a culture, the survival of the culture functions as a value. Those who have been induced to work for their culture need to foresee some of the problems to be solved. But many current features of a culture have an obvious bearing on its survival value. But many current features of a culture have an obvious bearing on its survival value. That's a little bit vague for me. Oops. The designs to be found in the utopian literature appeal to certain simplifying principles. They have the merit of emphasizing survival value. Will the utopia work? The world at large is, of course, much more complex, but the processes are the same, and practices work for the same reasons. Above all, there is the same advantage in stating objectives in behavioral terms. Stating objectives in behavioral terms. It's a little bit. I think what he means there is your objective is to get people to behave in a certain way. I think that's what he's saying. The use of science in designing a culture is commonly opposed. It is said that the science is inadequate, that its use may have disastrous consequences, that it will not produce a culture which members of other cultures will like, and in any case that men will somehow refuse to be controlled. The misuse of a technology of behavior is a serious matter, but we can guard against it best by looking not at putative controllers, but at the contingencies under which they control. I don't know what putative controllers means. I'm going to put a question mark. I'm going to put a question mark next to that whole sentence. I don't really know what it's saying. Okay. And I'm going to look up putative right now because that's a word I have heard before, and I think I have a rough idea of what it means. Putative, generally considered or reputed to be. Okay, so a putative controller is something that is generally considered to be a controller. The misuse of a technology behavior is a serious matter, but we can guard against it best by looking not at putative controllers, but at the contingencies under which they control. I don't have a great idea what he's saying there, so I would have to look in the chapter to get a more in-depth explanation of what he means. It is not the benevolence of a controller, but the contingencies under which he controls benevolently, which must be examined. Okay, so I think what he means controllers is like a dictator. So I think a putative controller is like a dictator. That would be an example. The benevolence of a controller, it is not the benevolence of a controller, but the contingencies under which he controls benevolently, which must be examined. All control is reciprocal, and an interchange between control and counter-control is essential to the evolution of a culture. The interchange, so let me start over again. All control is reciprocal, and an interchange between control and counter-control is essential to the evolution of a culture. The interchange is disturbed by the literatures of freedom and dignity, which interpret counter-control as the suppression rather than the correction of controlling practices. So that is a little bit vague for me. Put a question mark. The effect could be lethal. In spite of remarkable advantages, our culture may prove to have a fatal flaw. Some other culture may then make a greater contribution to the future. Okay, I think I have a rough idea of what he's saying there. So that's chapter 8, the design of a culture, and chapter 9 is what is man. That's the last chapter. An experimental analysis shifts the determination of behavior from autonomous man to the environment, an environment responsible both for the evolution of the species and for the repertoire acquired by each member. Early versions of environmentalism were inadequate because they could not explain how the environment worked, and much seemed to be left for autonomous man to do. But environmental contingencies now take over functions once attributed to autonomous man, and certain questions arise. Is man then, quote, abolished? Certainly not as a species or as an individual achiever. It is the autonomous inner man who is abolished, and that is a step forward. But does man not then become merely a victim or a passive observer of what is happening to him? So that's a rhetorical question. And he answers, he is indeed controlled by his environment, but we must remember that it is an environment largely of his own making. The evolution of a culture is a gigantic exercise in self-control. It is often said that a scientific view of man leads to wounded vanity, a sense of hopelessness and nostalgia. But no theory changes what it is a theory about. Man remains what he has always been, and a new theory may change what can be done with its subject matter. A scientific view of man offers exciting possibilities. We have not yet seen what man can make of man. And that is the end. So it's just this book is really far out, to use a term from the era in which it was written. It is far out. It's really out there. It's really different. I think it's really ahead of its time. Even now, it's ahead of its time. So it's just this guy's ideas are great to mine, to think about how you could use this to create a better company. You could use it to create a better country. You could use it to reform the prison system. You could use it to reform the education system. You could use it to achieve world peace. There's just so many applications of the ideas that he's putting out there. So it's really good stuff, and I'm trying to absorb it the best I can. So I'm going to call that a day. 1 second.